It is sometimes observed that the different characters of the high elves and dwarves can be likened to their favoured beverages of wine and beer. Where the elves savour fine wines, carefully sipped from tiny crystal glasses, the dwarves noisily swill gallons of foaming ale, pausing only to belch loudly and bellow for more. This contrast cannot have been more apparent than during the visit of the elf phoenix king, Bel Shanar, to Karaz-a-Karak, when, according to the dwarf hold's Book of Honour, the elf king presented the dwarf king, Snorri Whitebeard, with a single casket of Illyrian wine, a vintage so rich and precious that the cost of a single glass would bankrupt the average elf lord. The dwarf king, keen to show his appreciation, stove in the barrel lid with his axe and guzzled the whole lot down in one go, wiping the copious spillage with his beard as his fellow dwarves cheered loudly. Quite what the delicate elven courtiers made of this performance is not recorded. It can only be imagined what the elf king thought of the dozen barrels of Gastrangle's Oud Nasty dwarf ale and 2-gallon dwarf souvenir tankard that he received in return. Although the most northerly of the major dwarf realms is Carrack-Cadrin, there used to be a further stronghold, situated south of the high pass in the border mountains between Kislev and the Kislevite valleys on the far side, Carrack-Vlag. It was famed for many things, but mostly for the vast quantities of iron ore that lay under its granite peaks. The blacksmiths of Carrack-Vlag were the best in all the dwarf realms. The iron gates of the stronghold were a wonder to behold, with wrought iron dragons interwoven with scenes of battle, portraying the olden days when the dwarves beat off dragons to take the mountain for their own. The stronghold was said to be the most strongly fortified in the World's Edge Mountains. Its approach was protected by watchtowers, built into rocky pinnacles and linked together by hidden stairways through the rock. Even inside the stronghold, the main corridors were each covered by a huge iron portcullis that the dwarves could raise or lower to secure every part of the stronghold. The kings of Carrack-Vlag had need of such security, for they lived in the wildest, most dangerous part of the World's Edge Mountains, thick with chaos warbands and huge monsters. During the Great War against Chaos, the warping influence of Chaos spread south and enveloped Carrack-Vlag, cutting off the hold from the rest of the world. When dwarves returned, after the retreat of Chaos, they could find no trace of Carrack-Vlag. The entire stronghold had disappeared, as if it had never existed. The true fate of Carrack-Vlag may never be explained. Perhaps it was sucked into the realm of chaos, its inhabitants forced to suffer the attentions of demons for eternity. Maybe it was transported to some far-flung place or time, perhaps to the very demon world themselves. Probably no one will ever know the truth. When the fate of Carrack-Vlag comes up in conversation, dwarfs fall strangely silent, each burdened with his own worst fears. According to dwarf legends, the long-lost stronghold of Carrack-Zorn lies in the far south of the World's Edge Mountains, deep in the heart of the Southlands. Whether the stronghold exists, or even if it ever existed, is uncertain. But details of its fabulous treasures and the incredible wealth of its kings are often discussed over a few pints of dwarven ale. If tales are to be believed, Carrack-Zorn is carved from a mountain of gold. Its massive gates of ivory are bound with red copper. Rubies and diamonds are so common that they are used as minor units of currency instead of small coins. Supposedly, the stronghold is surrounded by steaming jungles full of fearsome creatures and hostile orcs. Maps circulate, purporting to show the location of Carrack-Zorn, but most are wildly different and look distinctly conjectural. Sometimes gullible adventurers pay good money for such maps, much to the derision of hardened adventurers who know better. Expeditions have never succeeded in finding the lost stronghold, but tales persist of explorers who find the place by accident, or who never seem to be able to retrace their steps, describe their route, or provide any convincing proof to back up their wild stories. To date, Karakzorn remains a fable, but perhaps one day a haggard dwarf explorer will solve what has remained the most perplexing mystery in all the dwarf realms. Down the long rampway, the dwarf army moved into the great underhall. The chamber was perhaps 10 bowshots long, and the same wide, and the ceiling seemed so far overhead that it might as well have been the sky. Indeed, ancient stonemasons had placed jewels there, so that they glittered like stars. Constellations of diamond and spiral arms of turquoise looked down coldly on the site of the coming battle. From 4 massive arched windows in the ceiling, columns of light descended, illuminating the massive vaulted chamber. A great chasm split the far left side of the chamber. A cold draught swept up its dank depths, pregnant with the smell of decay and things that had lain too long, decomposing in the darkness. The chill in the clammy air seeped through Thorgrim's cloak and touched his bones with slimy fingers. Here and there, vast stagnant pools filled depressions in the rough and uneven floor. Every 10 heartbeats, droplets of condensation plummeted hundreds of feet from the ceiling, rippling the water as they struck. A scum of phosphorescent algae glittered on the pool's oily surface. Mounds of rubble had formed where tons of rock had tumbled down. Toppled statues of ancient dwarf kings lay like fallen stone gods on the shattered ground round the chamber's edge. Forests of head-high luminescent and unhealthy fungi blotched the chamber floor in 6 places. On several levels, rampways and staircases entered the underhall, ancient access routes leading down forgotten paths to dark destinations. Thorgrim knew that this was one of the oldest and deepest parts of the city, dating from just after the time of the first Chaos incursion. It abutted the great underground highway, and like so much of Karaz-a-Karak, it was long been abandoned. There were just not enough dwarfs to occupy the entire city. Everpeak had been built to accommodate 100 times the number now dwelling there. Most of the population preferred to huddle close to each other in the western quarter of the city. A few tunnel fighters and sentries had been all that was left here to watch for intruders. And at last, those intruders had come. In the distance, Thorgrim could see the Skaven force the scouts had warned of. The Ratmen looked somehow more at home here among the ruins of the dwarf kingdom than the dwarfs did. That thought annoyed Thorgrim. It was as if the Skaven had evolved to fit in among the ruins and the debris of dead and dying civilizations. They looked destined to cling to the flotsam of history, while other, better, wiser races sunk into the depths. From high on his throne, borne aloft by 4 sturdy kingsmen, Thorgrim watched the enemy force deploy. The Skaven army was a seething black sea of mangy fur and lashing pink tails, thousands strong. As the dwarves entered the hall, the surge of the creatures took on a pattern as they fell into formation as if guided by one sinister intelligence. Amid the huge rabble, some order, some intelligence was visible. A line of huge rats surged to the fore, forming a skirmish screen across the enemy army's entire front, their biped brethren huddled beneath them. The centre was held by a block of giant creatures, part ogre, part rat. On the back of one perched a massive Skaven warrior, perhaps the army's general. Beside him, leprous ranks of scrofulous plague monks were drawn up behind their nightmare banner, the decomposing corpse of a beastman impaled like a roasting pig upon a pikestaff. Near them, plague censer-bearers whirled their spheres of contagious death. Masked and gauntleted poisoned wind galobadiers rushed between the many large units of storm vermin and clan rats, gingerly carrying their spherical crystal cargoes of poison gas. Behind the front ranks were massed regiment after regiment of fearsome Skaven warriors. In the centre of the entire army, perched on a statue of a fallen dwarf king, stood a grey seer, surveying the whole seething infernal mass of his verminous followers. He raised a grey paw for attention and chittered malevolently at the assembled Skaven, whipping them into a drooling, squealing frenzy of nightmare hatred. Thorgrim knew then that it was conquer or die. This was no mere expeditionary force, but a full Skaven army, the likes of which had not been seen in the Underhalls for long generations. He knew that it would have to be stopped now. He also knew that whatever happened here, new pages would be inscribed in the great book of grudges. "Form the chain of brotherhood," he commanded. He turned to survey his bold warriors. Each individual looked to the left and right, memorizing the faces of the warrior on either side. A low murmuring filled the chamber as each dwarf told his neighbours his name. In this way the fallen would be remembered by their comrades, and the names of the dead would be preserved forever in the Book of Grudges. It was a simple ritual. Every dwarf in every regiment already knew the names of all his fellows. Only if the entire regiment was slain to the last dwarf would all the names be lost. Not even then, if Thorgrim could help it. He had memorized the name and face of every dwarf in his army. He was no mere puny human, unable to remember the names and faces of a mere few hundred individuals. Proudly Thorgrim surveyed his army. Here was a sight to stir the heart and bristle the beard of any true dwarf. On either side of his throne were 2 regiments of long-bearded veterans, the oldest and most stalwart of his soldiers. To his left were Guttrie's hammerers, led by Guttrie Garrickson, his old comrade of 100 skirmishes. To his right was the Grim Brotherhood, led by Harek Harrickson, who had come all the way from Zufbar to pay their respects to Thorgrim and visit the great shrine of Grimnir. They had volunteered to accompany the army instantly when word of the Skaven incursion had come. In the twilight gloom of this part of the chamber, their rune weapons glittered coldly. To the left of the hammerers, the runesmith Crag stood atop his mighty sacred anvil, his great hammer in one hand. Soon Thorgrim knew he would summon lightning to smite the foe. To his left were drawn up 2 whole regiments of crossbow-armed dwarves. At this moment each brave warrior was cranking up his bow, increasing the tension on the strings in readiness to place the bolt in the firing channel. To the right of the Grim Brotherhood were the Slayers, led by their captain Scally Demon Slayer, mightiest of the Slayers of Karak. The death songs of the tattooed and crested dwarves echoed over the battlefield as they prepared to meet their fates. Already Thorgrim could see that they were working themselves up into a frenzy. Beside them, on the slight rise in the floor, sweating cannon crews manhandled their guns into position. Snorri Gunhammer lovingly polished the runes on his weapon, while Grunny Hellhammer supervised the positioning of the powder barrels. To their right was the new experimental flame cannon, fresh from the forges of the Engineers' Guild. To its right were the massed ranks of the Thunderers, their handguns already shouldered and ready for firing. From their elevated position they could get a clear shot at most of the battlefield. From behind the dwarf army came the sound of blades whirring and the steam engines coming up to pressure as the gyrocopter crews made ready to take to the air. Thorgrim gave the signal to unfurl the banner. The whole dwarf army let out a cheer as Valea's rune was unveiled. His army was ready to meet the rat-men breast to breast. It was ready to pit pure dwarf forged steel against rusty, scavenged, skaven weapons. It was prepared to match the tried and tested creations of the Engineers' Guild against the demented ingenuity of the rat-men. After this day, the dwarves would stand triumphant as skaven scavengers gnawed on the last bones of an ancient empire. At some unspoken signal, the rat-men moved forward, chittering and brandishing their weapons. The sheer speed of the advance was frightening. A black wave of thousands of gaunt feral bodies flowed over the broken ground. Yellow teeth glinted evilly in the half-light. Rat ogres bellowed their guttural challenges. The line of giant rats loped forward to the fore, large and hungry as starving wolves. The crack of giselles filled the air. Glowing shots pattered off the throne all around Thorgrim. He rose and stood proud, brandishing the axe of Grimnir defiantly at the distant Skaven snipers. Now an eerie glow concealed around the grey sayer as he drew magical energies to him. The energies congealed into a cloud of glittering gaseous vapour that enveloped each of the rat ogres in turn. Bloody foam frothed from the monsters' mouths as they let out shrieks of mangled glee and pain. "Steady, brothers, steady!" shouted Thorgrim, restraining his followers' natural urge to move forward towards their foes. He opened the great book and turned to Guthrie's warriors slowly and clearly. He recited the ancient and damning grudges, reminding each dwarf present of the aeon-old legacy of hatred and loathing that he owed the Skaven. As Thorgrim's grinding voice echoed out, the hammerers' faces went pale, and they began to shake with fury. A few let out great sobs of passionate hate. Some tore at their beards and uttered unspeakable maledictions against the rat-men. The grim brotherhood ducked their heads as gyrocopters swept overhead. One of the flying machines peeled off and headed for the giselles. One of the others headed for the right flank of the Skaven army. Another tore straight towards the middle. The pilot lit one of his bombs with his cigarello and tossed it out into the advancing mass. The bomb bounced, its fuse hissing and spluttering, and then exploded in the centre of a Skaven mass, sending broken and bleeding bodies tumbling through the air. Now the cannon spoke in voices of thunder. The acrid stink of powder smoke filled the air. The wail of cannon blast echoed throughout the chamber. The blazing shot tore right through the ranks of the rat ogres, smashing through their huge bodies as if they were made of paper. Thorgrim let out a yell of triumph as he saw the head of one of the beasts removed, sending blood fountaining into the air to cover the surrounding rats. The flame cannon sent a jet of incandescent chemical fire spurting out towards the foe. It landed on an oncoming formation of storm vermin and enveloped them in a sheet of incredibly hot flame. Their fur ignited, and the smell of scorched flesh and burning pelt filled the air. Skavens burned, screaming, burning rat-men ran everywhere. Some frantically writhed on the ground trying to extinguish the flames. Others simply died, their flesh melting and running like boiling tar. The few survivors of the blast turned and fled, ignoring the chittered instructions of their rat-ogre mounted general. Now the thunderers and crossbowmen blazed away at the oncoming horde. From their eyes the gunners could get a clear view of the enemy. Musket fire peppered the leading Skaven. Broken bodies fell bleeding onto the broken ground. Clouds of crossbow bolts flashed down into the giant rats. The great rodents died in droves, and they too turned and fled, more like simple brutes than the demon-driven monsters they had first appeared. Now Crag struck his anvil. Thorgrim's beard bristled. Blue lightning flickered round the head of his hammer. The bitter scent of ozone tugged at the back of Thorgrim's throat, mingling with a gunpowder taint. Lightning arced outwards towards the plague censer-bearers. Frantically, The grey seer chittered a counterspell, and a huge boat disintegrated in a shower of sparks. Undaunted, the Skaven came on, a gibbering, screaming horde, too numerous to count. Thorgrim could now see the mad pink eyes and their lash-in pink worm-like tails. They looked like an undisciplined, leaderless mass, but Thorgrim knew from the Great Book of Grudges that their fearsome mass attacks had overwhelmed many an army. Their fearsome war machines could slaughter masses given the opportunity. Now they were almost within range. As the rat ogres drew close to the dwarf army standard, Valea's rune glowed and pulsed. The frenzy seemed to leave the monsters as the ancestor goddess's symbol drained away the grey seer's evil magic. Suddenly, from behind one of the toppled statues, a band of black-garbed Skaven assassins leapt forth. Swiftly they scuttled towards the flame cannon crew. The lightly armoured gunners proved no match for the highly trained Skaven killers. A savage melee erupted around the weapon as the dwarves sold their lives dearly. One Skaven fell with the hands of a dying gunner wrapped immovably round its broken neck, even as the poisoned weapon buried itself deeply in the dwarf's gut. Thorgrim cursed the fact that he was too far away to intervene. That was one more item for the Great Book of Grudges. Once more, the Jezzail fire rang out. The rat gunners had obviously decided that Thorgrim was immune to their fire and concentrated on the cannons. Brave dwarf gunners fell, their bodies riddled with vile shot used by the foe. Thorgrim saw one dwarf fall to the ground, his body spasming in pain. A second shot tore into him, knocking him back a full 6 inches before he lay still. Once more the grey seer chanted, and to Thorgrim's horror, thousands of tiny red eyes winked in the gloom. It seemed as if all the rats who had ever infested the tunnels beneath Everpeak had been drawn together and massed in one great pack. The grey seer gestured, and the tide of vermin swept forward towards the dwarf army, their rabid jaws glistening. Crag summoned magical energies from the anvil with his hammer and sent a bolt of power lashing towards the oncoming rats. The malevolent intelligence that had bound them together faded, and they scampered away to whence they came. In the middle of the Skaven army, the grey seer gnawed his tail in frustration. Once more the hammer clanged against the anvil. Once more titanic bolts of Carusin energy leapt out at the poison wind globadiers. This time the grey seer's frantic counterspell failed, and 3 teams of the loathsome and deadly vermin fell, their brains fried and their eyes popping and splattering from the inside of their goggles. Thorgrim turned to the Grim Brotherhood and began to incite them. Hearing the ancient litany of death and woe, the Brotherhood fell into a dark reverie. Every jaw set with unquenchable determination to slay the Skaven. Every eye carried a fixed look of hatred directed towards the foe. A howl of frustrated anguish and bloodlust rose from the Grim Brotherhood as unrelentingly Thorgrim recited every misdeed the Skaven had performed against the hold of Zuthbar. Thorgrim's voice was almost drowned out by the bellow of the guns as they spat forth their freight of death. The Trollslayers almost advanced into the terrifying zone of death, and only Scally's brave, bellowed orders held them in place. Ignoring the assassins at large around the flame cannon, the gun crew continued to frantically load and fire their cannon. Glowing white cannonballs rained down on the cringing Skaven. More rat ogres fell under the onslaught of the mighty war machines. Crossbow bolt after crossbow bolt fell on lines of plague monks, a dark rain of death that relentlessly eroded even their rapidly unfeeling ratmen. Following the putrefying corpse banner, one entire flank of the Skaven army almost fell away under repeated battering from the Thunderers. The gyrocopters descended from the air. A burst of superheated steam tore through the Jezzail crews and sent the survivors scurrying back towards the depths from which they had emerged. The second gyrocopter pilot brought his craft around the line and crossed the Skaven army, laterally heading down the right flank to the left. His bomb bounced, narrowly missing the grey seer and exploding amongst a tightly packed mass of rat ogres, causing huge casualties. The last gyrocopter had so recently bombed the Skaven centre turned and skimmed the ground towards the rear of the Skaven army. With a great hiss, a great cloud of steam filled the air, and shrieks of the steam-boiled rats echoed beneath the vaulted ceiling. Spells darkened the air between the two armies as the grey seer frantically tried to reassert his power over the rat ogres. As a cloud of energy descended once more upon the spawn of Clan Moulder, Valea's rune glowed, neutralising the evil energies. Now lightning surged into the Warpfire crew and one of the few remaining poison wind globadiers. So short was the distance now that Thorgrim's beard bristled and his hair felt as if it was standing on end like a troll slayer's. The crisis point of the battle had arrived. The fast crumbling Skaven army was now within charge distance. The general howled his orders. The desperate Skaven threw themselves forward. Thorgrim snapped the great book of grudges shut. The time for remembering was past. Now was the time to settle old scores in blood. It was like something out of a nightmare, watching the vast wave of man-sized rats race towards him, all snapping jaws and lashing tails. The force of the first wave almost smashed through the steel wall of dwarves and broke their line. Almost, but not quite. The dwarves stood firm as an avalanche of black-furred death swept down upon them. A vile odour of terrible flesh filled the air. Thorgrim shouted to his troops to hold their breath. This was the dreaded poison wind of which the globadiers were justly feared and hated. There was a flash of fire on the far right, and at first Thorgrim thought that the flame cannon had exploded. But then he realised the fire was a different colour, tinged with purple and a strange, almost black. The smell of burning meat, sizzled fat, filled the air. Doubtless a warp fire thrower had taken effect on the Thunderers. Now the fighting became close and deadly as steel-muscled Skaven warriors sprang forward relentlessly, their great blades cleaving into the dwarf ranks. Worse still, deadly assassins armed with poison-dripping blades leapt from the swarms of lesser warriors and lashed out at the dwarven leaders. Thorgrim saw Guthrie himself go down, his rune weapon falling from his nerveless fingers. Another entry for the book, he thought, as he found himself confronting the great rat ogres and the Skaven general. The impact of the general's lance almost pinned him to the throne, but the ancient treasured armour of his ancestors held. Ignoring the sparks flickering before his eyes, the dwarf king prepared to fight back. Goaded by their handlers, the mighty war beasts fell on Thorgrim's bearers. Mighty claws lashed out, shredding Gromril armour like paper and tearing through great gashes in the side of the dwarves. Momentarily, Thorgrim saw a flash of pure white bone through pink meat as Grimly's ribs were exposed by the attack. Then Thorgrim's flesh tingled as the throne unleashed its power. The skin of Gimli's side knitted together, and smooth new pink flesh replaced the old mangle. Wild exultation filled Thorgrim. The axe of Grimnir pulsed with power in his hand. He felt godlike, invincible, deadly. A lesser warrior might have been filled with fear for such a deadly living killing machine as the rat ogre, but Thorgrim knew he was its master. Bracing his feet wide on the throne, he lashed out with his axe. The ancient runes on the weapon's side burned bright as it bit into the rat ogre's side, splintering ribs as if they were rotten timbers. His second blow severed the thing's spine and sent it flopping to the ground in two separate halves. The eruption of filth and gore covered the Skaven general, blinding it momentarily. Thorgrim took advantage of its distraction to bury his axe in its skull, cleaving it almost in two. Grimly and the other bearers lashed out with their axes, cutting and hacking their way through the rat ogres. The giant beasts snarled ferally even as they fell. Not even death, it seemed, could extinguish the mad hatred for all other living things. For a moment, there was a lull in the battle. From his position on the throne, Thorgrim could survey the whole battle line. Thorgrim knew this nightmarish scene would burn itself into his brain for the rest of his days. The screams of the dying and the war cries of the living mingled and filled the underhall with a hellish cacophony. The flickering, unearthly flame jets of the warp fire throwers give fitful illumination to the dreadful tableau. Countless dead and dying lay everywhere. The wounded lay together, their lives sleeping away through holes in their rent flesh. Overhead, the gyrocopters swooped like great insects, the thunder of their rotors adding to the cacophony. A huge, black, screaming mob, hundreds strong, had smashed into the dwarf line and threatened to overwhelm it. On the right, the Thunderers had taken terrible casualties from the warp fire throwers. They had shamefully turned and fled before the onslaught of supernatural flames. Ratmen had overrun the cannons and snapped at the heels of Crag as he stood atop his anvil. Even as Thorgrim watched, the runesmith whipped up the lightning and sent Scorch and mangled Skaven tumbling back from the sacred artifact. The slayers had surged forward through the Ratmen's ranks, leaving a trail of broken and bloody bodies behind them. Scally fought with irresistible force as he clove a bloody path towards the Grey Seer. His slayer brethren hurled insults and jeers at the retreating Skaven. On all the battlefield, nothing seemed a match for their insane ferocity. The Grim Brotherhood and the Plague Monks fought breast to breast. It was a scene of madness. Both sides lashed out, driven by utter insatiable hatred. It was hard to tell who had the mastery. Neither force was willing to give ground. Plague Monks ripped at the throats of dwarf warriors with their teeth. Even as they died, the dwarves struck out with their axes. Around Harek's feet lay the dismembered bodies of all the plague censer-bearers. The runes on the Zafbari had killed them outright before they could unleash their deadly weapons. From the rear of the Grim Brotherhood's ranks, clouds of sickly green vapour rose where the poison wind had been unleashed. Thorgrim could see poisoned dwarves reel and fall, bloody froth bubbling from their mouths and nostrils. One more entry for the Dameskron. On the left, the Hammerers had turned back the storm vermin. Enraged by the loss of their leaders, the dwarf veterans fought like unleashed demons, mighty hammers smashing like eggshells the Skaven in front of them. The assassin who had struck down Guthrie was mashed to jelly by Guthrie's kinsmen. Thorgrim knew that the death of 200 such vermin would not be enough to repay one drop of Guthrie's blood. Yes, the Skaven would pay. Thorgrim would see to that. On the extreme left, the crossbowmen had started to reform into a deeper formation, preparing to enter the maelstrom of hand-to-hand combat. There was nothing else for it now, Thorgrim realized. "Forward, brothers!" he shouted. Slowly, inexorably, the throne-bearers began to carry him forward, over the corpses of the rat ogres, into the flanks of the plague monks. The axe of Grimnir sang a song of doom and destruction in his hands. Nothing that came within reach lived. The leprous forms of the plague monks squelched and fell apart as he cut into them. One threw himself straight at Thorgrim. The dwarf king caught it by its slimy and pestilent throat, halting its flight in mid-air, forcing the snarling monk to his knees in front of him before severing its neck with a single stroke. His bearers lashed out, bringing a whirlwind of death to the monks of Clan Pestilence. Heartened by the king's presence, the Grim Brotherhood surged forward, slaughtering the plague monks to the last. They left no diseased Skaven alive. Their foul bodies were heaped high, polluting the good earth around their awful standard. The Hammerers smashed through the last remaining storm vermin and surged forward into the Skaven following, who turned on their heels and fled. As suddenly as a summer storm, the battle became a rout. Seeing Scally and his lads forge in towards him, the grey seer disappeared in a flash of light and cloud of brimstone. The Thunderers reformed their ranks to face the warp fire throwers, looking down the barrels of a line of dwarf musket and seeing their isolation. The warp fire thrower teams suddenly thought the better of standing their ground. They turned and fled towards where they had come from. The assassins round the cannons slipped away before Thorgrim could give the order to pursue, scattering in all directions and rushing for the shadows as if all the demons of chaos were on their heels. From the air, the gyrocopters swooped on the fleeing Skaven, routing them utterly, flying amid the terrified foe and squirting them with great gouts of steam. Suddenly the dwarves stood alone, in possession of a battlefield carpeted with black-furred corpses. Thorgrim surveyed a scene of utter carnage, of hacked-up bodies and mangled flesh. He looked out on the field and was filled with a mixture of triumph and gloom. One by one, the captains of the dwarf regiments made their way through the twilight towards him. One by one they kneeled before the throne. Thorgrim opened the great book of grudges. "Name the dead," he commanded. Other races do not consider dwarfs a very musical people. Dwarfs, on the other hand, know what they like. They like raucous singing, they like thumping their hands and pounding their fists rhythmically on the table, and most of all, they like their music loud. In fact, once a dwarf has a few pints of ale in his belly, it is very difficult to stop him singing. When a company of dwarves gathers in a traveller's inn, the inevitable always happens. A great deal of ale is drunk, and the dwarves will sing long into the night. And as the evening draws on, the songs get louder and increasingly vulgar, for dwarfs have an earthy sense of humour at best, and are not overly sensitive about the feelings of other more delicate folk. Their deep grating and bellowing voices are not generally appreciated by the likes of men, and elves have been known to go deathly pale and to quiver pathetically when obliged to listen to a dwarf in full voice. During their infamous and now probably wisely forgotten tour of the Reichland, the Zufbar Miners' Close Harmony Choir drank the entire town of Grunberg dry and caused riots in Wissenberg, Kemperbad and Uttersieg. Their leader, the huge and extraordinary obese Borin Bullroper, was arrested in Altdorf for his performance panicked some passing horses, leading to the great Altdorf stampede. Tension was already high, due partly to the dwarves' reputation for drunkenness, and also to the incalculable damage done to the Emperor's window in Sigmar's temple during Balrora's memorable performance of She Was Only a Halfling's Daughter. As Borin pointed out, it was hardly his fault if shoddy human workmanship had proven unable to stand up to his spiriting singing, and the same went for the temple's poorly laid foundations. Rorik Forkbeard glared out into the darkness, knowing that something moved out there, beyond the circle of the fire's flickering light. Watching hungry eyes measured him. A malign intelligence studied his every move. Casually, Rorik finished the rest of his dried beef, then swigged the last of his ale before reaching out for his axe. He wiped his mouth on his arm, ran one huge hand through his stubble, and shaved his scalp and spat into the fire. The saliva sizzled as it evaporated. Rorik stood up and made an experimental cut with his weapon. The weight of the axe felt good in his hand. The runes glowed readily, whether on the reflection of the fire or the sullen glow of their own inner light, he could not tell. The grip might have been moulded for his grasp. It had belonged to his father, and his grandfather before him, and his grandfather before that. It was a potent weapon, tempered by the blood of many enemies and bright with the runes of ancient days. Tonight it would stand him in good stead. He stood silent for a moment, listening to the night sounds. The fire crackled. Somewhere in the distance an owl hooted. There! He heard the sound of flesh on rock, as if something very large was trying to move stealthily and failing. Soon, Rorik thought. Soon it would be over. He had come a long way to this god-forsaken place, to exact vengeance for his brother and atonement for his own shame. Rorik looked into his heart and found nothing but ashes there. He had lost all honour by letting his brother die. He was the eldest. It had been his duty to shield the lad. He had failed, and the last of his bloodkin was gone. The trust his father had placed in him had been ill-founded. The shame of it would have made Rorak tear out his hair, had most of it not already been shaved off. Grief and rage warred in him, and he suddenly felt nothing but the urge to lash out, to rend and to slay, to focus all his pent-up pain and anger against something. It had been his job to lead the mail train of ore down into the empire of the Manlings. He should have been with the caravan, and had been destroyed. The cave-in at the mine had crushed his leg and laid him up for a month. Young Albrim had gone in his place, though his beard barely had an inch on it. The stupid lad had thought he could guide the caravan through the troll-hunted mountains and save the year's profits. Now his bones mingled with all the others the troll had taken. Well, no more. Tonight it ended. Tonight the troll would die if he had to crawl down its throat and choke it. A shadow, huge and dark, moved in the distance. Rorik laughed aloud. The wild, bitter sound echoed through the rocks. "Come out and die," he shouted, "or I'll come over there and get you." Slowly the thing shambled forward. It was enormous. Its yellow tusks were long as daggers, and the light of blood madness glittered in the deep caves of its eyes. It flexed claws like scimitars. It let out a bellow of a challenge, a weird, undulating cry that would have frozen the marrow of many a bold warrior. Any sane being would have been terrified. Rorik just looked up at the towering creature. It was 3 times its height and 20 times its weight. He did not care. His death song was sung. To his friends, he was already dead. He considered himself a walking corpse. What use had he for fear? He curled his lip into a sneer. "Your life is over," he told the troll, then threw himself forward, axe raised to strike.